Good evening. My name is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our LaRouche PAC strategic overview and discussion for Monday, January 15th. And there's a lot going on today, starting with the fact that we have the Iowa caucuses taking place. As we know, as President Trump said, Iowa caucuses kick us off, and today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And this is a very important time in terms of determining the direction for our nation and for humanity. And today's discussion is going to be on a very important theme of globalization be damned. And that has been the theme of President Trump and President Trump's commitment to putting America first, putting the American people first, and addressing the return to a productive economy, manufacturing economy. One of the things we're going to discuss today is, as we've seen, the enemy of mankind, the enemy of our nation and our nation's progress has made it their number one priority that under no circumstance can Trump have a second term in office. And that same enemy we have warned about has been the imperial interest in the globalist British Empire, and people like those who have written the House of Lords report that we've talked about in our 5-part series. If people haven't had a chance to read the 5-part series on why the British kill American presidents, we've talked about this a lot. It's actually gotten quite a bit of traction. This report has gotten one of the authors of it to be interviewed on places such as the Jim Hoff report, and has also been picked up in many other networks and avenues. And I bring this up because what we're seeing right now, as you have more of the prosecutions coming out against President Trump, the insane judges who are refusing to allow him to be able to defend himself. And also recently you had what's going on in Georgia with the criminal activity of the lead prosecutor there, Fani Willis, and her saying that the tax money that she's been using for her lover to go and run the operations against President Donald Trump, the attacks on her are not warranted because she's a Black woman. I mean, this is what you have going on in terms of the insanity that's happening, but yet and still, President Trump is gaining more traction as he's continued to gain more support from the population, his constituency. The MAGA movement is growing, not only amongst people who would be amongst already Trump supporters, but those who recognize that what we see going on in terms of the collapse of our economy, our open borders, the insane policies of the destruction of the Black communities per se, such as in Chicago, bringing more people into the Trump camp. And this is freaking out the works right now, as we are seeing more and more of the globalist people like Richard Dearlove and John Bolton and these warmongering neocons and others are coming out and saying that if Trump were to get another election, to be elected again, that this would destroy the global order. And we're going to talk about why this liberal order of the globalist agenda has been the number one priority for President Trump to destroy, to put an end to these endless wars. So before I'm going to turn it over to Michael, and we're going to kind of go back and forth on a couple of thoughts here, a couple of the theme areas. I do want to say again, as we are having this discussion, the Iowa caucuses are taking place. We probably won't find out as far as what the results are from that caucus till later. Also, in the context of this discussion on the globalist attack on President Trump, it was made very clear, and in terms of reports that came out and interviews that were coming out today, that in the middle of the drive, where you still see we're the third month of war between Hamas, Gaza, in the Gaza, and Israel. You also have the Davos summit, World Economic Summit, that is taking place starting tomorrow. And this is going to be a major discussion in terms of what's going to happen with the United States. I will say that it's very important to note that President Trump just got the endorsement of the second senator in Florida, which is Marco Rubio. So there's a lot to talk about today, a lot of area to cover. And I think what we'll do is I'm going to bring in Mike here in terms of taking up some of his thoughts on what's happening, some of these developments, and then we'll go back and forth and bring you guys in for a discussion as well.
Great, thanks, Keisha. So let me read a few things here. This is Sir Richard Dearlove. He was the MI6 head, kind of, I guess, emeritus at this point, responsible for the dodgy dossier for the Iraq War that talked about weapons of mass destruction and the potential to strike the UK and other locations. He said in a Sky TV interview, and he also was infamous for running, to all intents and purposes, when you look at the connections that Christopher Steele had and who was directly involved in doing a lot of the entrapment operations of people like Michael Flynn on British soil, you see Richard Dearlove at the center of that entire Russiagate operation against Donald Trump. This is Richard Dearlove in an interview with Sky News in London. He said, from an intelligence perspective, two things we need to worry about. One, Ukraine, and then China's long-term behavior globally in terms of Taiwan and so on. And then he says, you have to add a political threat, which I'm worried about, which is Trump's re-election, which I think for the UK's national security is problematic, because if Trump, as it were, acts hastily and damages the Atlantic Alliance, that is a big deal for the UK. So that's the first thing I wanted to read. The second thing, this is Christine Lagarde. She's now the head of the IMF. She's now head of the European Central Bank. She was formerly head of the IMF, and I think was a finance minister in France. She did an interview on France 2 television on Thursday. And what she described, she said, if we draw lessons from history, by which I mean to say the manner in which Trump carried out the first 4 years of his mandate, it is clearly a threat. It is enough to look at trade tariffs, the commitment to NATO, the fight against climate change. In these 3 areas alone in the past, that is Trump's previous 4 years, in the past, US interests were not aligned with those of Europe. So these reports and statements coincide with other activity by what's been reported from the British Foreign Affairs Committee and the British, I think, House of Commons is putting together a report echoing the House of Lords report that we often refer to from 2018 that looks at the threats of a second Trump term. As the House of Lords report said in 2018, we can handle a first term, we can't handle a second. People may remember Tim DeRock, the UK ambassador, who talked about flooding the zone and basically exploiting every possible option around the presidency to shape US policy while Trump was in office. That got exposed and he was tossed out somewhat heroically in the eyes of the British, I think. So the globalist order is certainly best expressed by people like Christine Lagarde and Richard Dearlove. These are representatives, as many of them, and probably both of them, will be at the Davos summit starting today in Switzerland. So it's not our assessment. It's not my assessment. It's not LaRouche PAC's assessment that Donald Trump is a threat to the globalist order, and that what's happening in Iowa tonight is just the beginning of the biggest comeback, in maybe in history, in terms of the tenacity that Trump has had to endure what he's had to endure, and the American people's willingness to actually triumph over their own apathy, which was overwhelmingly existent even during Trump's first term. And to deal with COVID, which was a very nasty operation, to deal with the election, November 3rd, to deal with the J6 flags, and to come back stronger and stronger and stronger. There's all kinds of issues. There's all kinds of attempts to undermine the American people. But as Keisha mentioned, Trump is rallying in Iowa. He has not taken anything for granted, despite what DeSantis or Haley might want to say. He has picked up more and more endorsements of senators, governors, and congressmen in the recent period. And people like DeSantis and Haley have just been mocked and ridiculed on the ground in places like Iowa. So you never take anything for granted. We will start to get the outcome of the Iowa caucuses around 9 p.m. Eastern tonight, so sometime after this call. But it's their assessment. Leading financiers and the intelligence operatives, it's their assessment that this election could be disruptive. Now, as Keisha mentioned, and we've referenced many times before, Trump gave a remarkable speech at Davos. I think it's could even be 2020.
Yes.
Yeah, right before the COVID sets in, where he gives a speech basically shaking his finger at the doomsayers, the gloom and doomers, the people talking about apocalypse from the end of oil and climate change and overpopulation and all these questions, of which none of their dark forecasts have ever come true, that mankind has prevailed over every so-called obstacle, imagined or real, to continue to potentially thrive and prosper. But certainly these apocalyptic doomsayers are not looking to encourage the productivity of the population. And he references the greatness of the cathedrals and makes specific reference to the domes in Florence, the dome in Florence, the Great Dome. Now, I reference that because there's something to say of what is this global order. People oftentimes say, well, who is it? Well, the problem with saying who is it makes it seem as if it's like an organized crime family, that if you knock it out, it could possibly go away. It makes it more local. It makes it local in space, but also in time, meaning that we take for granted what this political fight, how long it's been going on. So let me be more specific and not, this grouping, this order of globalists goes back into the 1500s. So we're talking of 450 to 500 years. And there's a unique factor that is worth recounting some of what that means to understand why this enemy today is far more trapped and panicked and desperate. Why our willingness to say the possible threat of assassination is there is because they don't have a lot of other options. They don't have necessarily a place to run to. There are many Chinese running to Davos for whatever reason, probably because of economic investments and things that China seems to rely on. They also do a lot of production of solar and wind production technologies and EVs. So their economy is tied into some of this doomsday, climate change kind of program. That's not good for China, for the Chinese people. But there isn't a place for the empire to go to. Here's what I mean. And well, let me pause for a second and say, if there's a reason, and there is reason, the reason to celebrate and acknowledge Dr. Martin Luther King was because, especially in this context, it is a reminder that to those people who take up the cause of this nation, of its people, and are willing to challenge the warmongers, to challenge the kind of financial establishment and yuppie crowd, which has largely tried to co-opt King. I mean, when Jamie Dimon is preaching Martin Luther King, you know, they've turned it into a brand, a Gucci brand label versus the substance of King. But King was willing to put his life on the line for questions such as war and peace and the livelihood of the working class, in this case, the African American class, but also more broadly, the working class in general, as a mass-based movement to shape the presidency and shape the country. And on that basis, he was willing to put his life, and did then put his life, to the test of that. And it's the same reason why Trump could be targeted today. It's the same reason why Lyndon LaRouche was targeted during his time in political leadership. But what is this system that we're threatening to overthrow? It's worth identifying it to understand the strategic context. Because, as many of you know, and I don't want to recount all the details, but let me just make quick reference to them. The situation in the Middle East is escalating. There have been, the United States launched attacks on Yemen. We talked about the escalations last week. There's now, of course, more. There's attempts by the Houthis to attack U.S.-owned and operated vessels. And there are defensive measures taken by U.S. naval ships. So that's there. There was also an attack by Iran on an ISIS base in Iraq, as well as a Mossad, what they described as a Mossad base. This is just reported. Who knows what's actually true? But there's an ongoing kind of responses. ISIS was apparently responsible for the attack in Iran that killed some hundreds of Iranians and wounded hundreds more. And of course, ISIS was part of U.S. intelligence, British intelligence operations in Syria. So that escalation alone is frightening. There's also a sense that quantitative tightening from the Federal Reserve is ending, and they're going back to loose money printing, hopefully to try to booster the economy for Joe Biden's reelection campaign. So the campaign begins, of course, with more money printing. But those two aspects, the war and the economy, especially the central bank aspect of how they control the economy, are essential to understand what this system is. But it goes back, as I mentioned, 500 years. Why is this important? The reason this current liberal imperial system was adopted was because the old system, perhaps best expressed by the Spanish Empire at that time, the Habsburg Spanish Empire in the 1500s was ruled by Philip II, was a dominant empire of a feudal, what's the name? Hereditary aristocracy. So hand it to your children. You own the land, you own the wealth. There's a set of an aristocratic system that runs it. So it was kind of a feudal empire. And the wealth that Spain had, which was the largest of any nation, perhaps any empire ever, was the monetary wealth they had gained, because if everyone says we should go back to a gold-based system entirely. Well, the Spanish took all the gold out of South America and were able to flood then the European market with wealth, which largely went to, like today's money printing of the Fed, goes to your elite class. So there's this huge amount of monetary wealth. Spain has a massive, massive treasury, like we had going into the Iraq War. I mean, we didn't have a huge treasury, but we did. We didn't have, the debt was not nearly what it is today. So they were the king. And they represented this kind of feudal European structure. But this structure by the 1500s was already under threat. By the time that Spain has consolidated its own territory and launched efforts to the New World in the late 1400s, we all know the old 1492 sailed the ocean blue. So by the mid 1500s, when this wealth has been accumulated, the impacts of the Renaissance, and Bob Ingram has given classes on this, it's somewhat of a limited term. It's no reason to call it a renaissance. It was an explosion of industrial, scientific, and artistic activity. All of a sudden, this lid that had been kept on various creative efforts, all of a sudden exploded in every possible area. And the Brunelleschi Dome of Florence was perhaps the pinnacle of this activity. But there were others, people like Joan of Arc, someone who was also assassinated or killed, imprisoned and then killed, burned at the stake at 19. But she called forth the people of France and the king, or the crown prince at the time, to crown him, to lift the siege of the British soldiers on the key French towns, and to bring France into a nation state. And she said that she had visions of angels sent from God that told her to raise the siege of Orleans and to crown the King of France in the ancient cathedral in Reims, in northern France, and to establish the French kingdom in full. And this is happening at the same time that you're getting this explosion of creative and industrial activity and philosophical insights. So the nation state was an integral part. This is the development. Joan of Arc is the basis for the consolidation of the first known nation state in human existence. The consolidation of that ultimately under Louis XI of France, and France becomes the dominant European power. She's killed in 1431, just to give you some time frame. So, and again, the enemy kills those unique people that lead their people toward a rallying cry towards the betterment of themselves, but to empower them as a nation to then better the community more broadly. Today, it's a global community. And that's the threat of a nation state to an imperial system. So even though Spain has amassed this massive power and this feudal hereditary kind of empire, global aristocracy, there's this explosion of creative development and the creative sense of a nation state that cannot be controlled. And there were a few people, and I'm not going to list a bunch of names. I'm not going to try to give a class. I'm going to try to put this in as the simplest conceptual terms I think are appropriate and capture the point. And we can develop this more if it's useful. But there are leading figures out of Venice who represent these old financial imperial interests, who realize that if you stick with this old feudal system, we will lose. We will, in a competition between this new level of industrial and scientific growth, combined with the nation state, we will lose. We have to set up an entirely different system. It's a system that operates almost independent of nation states. It's more about finance and commerce. And they build up a whole system, but they have to implement this. They have to implement this structure somehow. Well, they get a unique opportunity. They help finance the Reformation, the split from the Catholic Church into the Protestants, and then turn the Catholic Church to be the embodiment of this oppressive feudal system. And they rally converts to the Protestant cause to support the people of the Netherlands, who happen, based on all the various marriages, all the way up in the north of Europe, to be under the rule of the Spanish monarchy. And this war goes on for a few decades. And ultimately, the Netherlands achieve their independence. But the irony of it is, and this can be told as a great heroic story of fighting in the independence of the Protestants against the tyranny of both the Catholic Church and the Spanish Habsburgs. But while the Netherlands and the Dutch are basically revolting against this and achieving their independence, they are becoming the seat of what is considered a liberal financial empire. And it is this liberal financial empire that ultimately, under the head of the Netherlands, William of Orange, moves to London, takes over the British crown in what's called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. A few generations later, basically. It's the third generation. And moves to London. And that's how it ultimately becomes British. Now, that's just some of the specific historical facts of how this plays out. The bigger point is that they saw an opportunity through a liberal outlook, and you get a bunch of British philosophers, Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Adam Smith, become the apologists for this new liberal kind of, it's a monarchy, but it's not. It's now much more of a system of financial control, financial empire, cheap labor, globalist policies of exploitation of peoples, including their own, in their own country, but also anywhere else on the planet that they can find, for cheap labor, extraction of resources, and financial control. And they thought they had beaten, and to a large extent, they had beaten this industrial, scientific, patriotic faction. The Joan of Arc faction was basically overwhelmed in Europe. But some people, like the Pilgrims and others, found footing in this world, in this new world, and had a different kind of conception of what they could build. And that was something the enemy didn't expect, and they tried to crush it. As we know, they tried to crush it in the 1680s. They tried to crush it in the 1760s. I mean, explicit, like heavy-handed, with obviously operations all in between. They tried to crush it with the Revolutionary War, and then again the Confederacy, as well as all the assassinations of presidents. But they have not yet crushed it. But today, as they run this liberal empire and they've taken over large swaths of our country, they've occupied DC, they occupy Wall Street and our banking community, they run all of the universities, the ideologies that these artificial ideologies they've constructed, which ultimately devolved into gender and sexual and racial and bizarre categorical ideologies, almost like basically Nazi stuff when you get down to it. But they are still dealing with the threat of the United States today. And it's this which is that we are looking to bring down, which is what Dearlove and Lagarde are referring to. And so this makes it, I mean, this is why this question has become such a huge deal. You wonder, why are they going to such an extent? Why aren't they willing to compromise? Because they don't have another option. They had an option in the 1500s. They built an option. They built the liberal option. And there's an in-depth analysis of how they even constructed a liberal philosophical outlook. But they constructed it and said, this is an option. They haven't built an option today. They don't have an escape hatch. If the resurgence of the nation-state conception begins to again go on the ascendance, if the United States claims that it's committing to a system of nation states and it's supporting the existence of the creation of nation states all over the world, they don't have an antidote or an answer, largely because the liberal program that's supposed to sound all nice and scientific and philosophical and thoughtful and blah, 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 has ultimately, the face has been ripped off. These are a bunch of, feudalistic, inquisitor, violent, warmonger, torturer, depopulation, Nazi fanatics. These are not like, we're just here to open up debate. We want to get rid of these oppressive structures like Christendom and the Catholic Church or whatever, or Christianity. They can keep trying to say that. They can keep using whipping boys like George Bush or other kind of rhino Republicans. But ultimately, look what they're doing in the Middle East. Look what they're doing in Ukraine. Look what they did in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq. They're just massive devastation. Look what they've done to our own country. That ultimately, at some point, they either have to be able to impose that old order of feudal control on the population with a strong boot on the neck of the people, or somehow be able to eliminate any options to revive the nation state conception. And they have not been able to eliminate it. This was Lyndon LaRouche's guiding focus in his interventions as a presidential candidate and politically over 50 years in this country and globally, that this revival of this question against this liberal empire has been an ongoing fight for 500 years. And every person who's been alive within those 500 years had a responsibility to become cognizant of that fight. And the leaders of the American Revolution were. Lincoln was. To the scope of Lyndon LaRouche, he had his whole organization do a massive research project to understand this picture better, but they understood it and operated from that strategic perspective. That's what our dossier is meant to get across. And I think that really is Iowa will be the shot heard around the world tonight, because whatever naysaying they've wanted to make, this is now real. Trump is coming back. The panic is setting in to the dark lords of Europe and Washington, D.C. The writing's on the wall. Trump is nearly unbeatable, both by the Republican primaries or by Joe Biden in any fair competition. And we haven't even seen Trump or this movement open up on a broader general campaign for the American people. He's been limited to, organizing people in the Republican primary. Let's take this fight against this kind of liberal imperial rot, with no option of returning to the feudal one either, but to actually bring to bear consciously, once and for all, the true system of nation states led by the United States. That's what's threatened. That's the unspoken words that our enemy knows that we want to make conscious in the minds of Americans as we start the election process tonight. And so, Keisha, those are my opening comments. Maybe you want to have some responses, and then we'll see what other people are thinking.
Yeah, I do. I think that what you just presented is really important, because it's one thing just to throw out the terms of globalism and, talking about the impact of the British order and the British Empire. But I would like for you to take up this question a little bit more, because, there is a distinction between liberalism, as you were just discussing it, and the historic precedent of the liberal order. And from the standpoint that when people think about liberal, they're thinking about the Democrat Party, they're thinking about all of the insane policies that you see coming out of the Democrat Party, from gender modification to what's happening with DEI, racial equities, all this kind of stuff, and just everything, the insane policies that Biden or socialist agenda as liberal. This is what the liberals do. But that's not what, in terms of the context of looking at this, what goes back to the 1500s and even before that, what goes back to this Venetian oligarchy and liberalism. It's a real scientific fight behind that. And I know you said you didn't want to get into a whole class about it, but I think you should actually distinguish the two as, in terms of the scientific concepts and orientation of how this liberalism has has come about. And also, now you said that you referenced the Spanish aspect of it. The Spanish were, in terms of the Spanish oligarchy and its role in liberalism. But how did that play into the current, or what became the more known Venetian oligarchy,
Well,
and
yeah, there's
also the
yeah,
Anglo-Dutch aspect of it?
right.
So
So,
there's several
okay, I'll take up the
components.
second part. So the
Okay.
Spanish had become the dominant country of the feudal program and how that expanded into a global system with the extraction and exploitation of people and resources in the Americas and in the Indies. So the Spanish had amassed this huge amount of like the Gulf states with oil today to some extent, where they just have this abundance of money. But Spain was also a dominant population within the European context. And so they became the center also of the Inquisition, which was this. It had other elements earlier. I mean, Joan of Arc was killed basically by the Inquisition institutions
Right.
in France earlier, but by the early 1500s, Spain was the center of the Inquisition. So the Inquisition was much like what we had with Bush and Cheney. It became the whipping boy for an opposition that, if you deployed effectively, could be controlled opposition. And so a grouping in Venice saw the opportunity to exploit a potential revolt in the Netherlands, where the Netherlands was drastically culturally different from the Spanish culture and kingdom, worlds apart in essence. And so there was a brewing potential revolt. There was the Reformation. They had become largely Protestant. And so that was a rallying cry for all over Europe, for those sympathetic to revolting against this inquisition of this Catholic Church that was now exemplified by the Inquisition, of violence and terror and torture and paranoia, that could break from it. So the Venetians deploy then effectively into the Netherlands. But that's the Spanish question, and that goes on for a number of decades. Ultimately, the Netherlands are successful. But that whole thing bleeds into then what becomes the 30 Years War, or the 80 Years War, that is a religious conflict in Europe till 1648. And that's what I mean by largely just destroy. They were able to largely suffocate and destroy, not entirely, but the political ability to consolidate the nation states. And this process continues through the French Revolution and the ultimate destruction of France, which was, by all means, the leading nation of Europe from Joan of Arc's time up until that French Revolution. So, but Europe had lost some of the foothold, but it had gained a foothold in the United States. And that's the main question of the development of this process, of what we're a part of here as American citizens, what this political experiment is, what Trump is reviving in the hearts and sinews of the American people, is this question of having broken from this kind of cultural and political corruption, to establish something that could capture the dignity of man and unleash the powers of industry and creativity and science. So the actual liberal, when we talk about, when I reference liberal, I don't mean, of course, just a sympathetic person that wants to help the poor. But of course, as we all know, that's not really what liberals are today anymore. They're much more what they were intended, what the liberal intended to be. But it's certainly a central banking operation. They wanted to make sure they controlled finance and money, separate from this kind of gold-backed resource that was dominating Europe at that time. But it was also a commodity-based operation. But they ultimately wanted to control the way people thought. That this explosion of creative industry and scientific thought was deeply connected to mankind's, the individual's relationship to the creator. And that, in essence, made it so powerful because the nation state concept was intimately tied to the individual's relationship to the creator. That's what Joan of Arc was operating from. I mean, her references to the King of France is something like, I'm here on behalf of the kingdom of heaven, and he's willing to make you the King of France. But that was truly a sovereign conception, but not something that the king was declaring. She was barely even a citizen of France, but she was ultimately the leading citizen of France that was able to bring to bear this conception of a nation state. So this explosion of scientific and industrial and political activity and creative activity, as Brunelleschi's Dome, was premised on the individual minds, the value of the individual and their mind's relationship, an evolving relationship with the creator, and that could be socialized, that discoveries made by Joan of Arc or by Brunelleschi or by the scientist Kepler, that these discoveries made by the individual in dialogue with the creator, in essence, could be then shared and communicated with the population more broadly.
So like you said, all of these people that were at the center of this liberal order, or liberalism, that followed behind, that became the pinnacle of that, such as Locke, Hume, Hobbes, people that we learn about all the time, the key person that they were following in that Venetian oligarchical order was a guy by the name of Paolo Sarpi. But it all goes to this very principled point that these individuals didn't believe in the concept as Joan of Arc, as those of the nation state understood, that at the center of a nation state was the progress of the human creative potential in the human mind.
Well, so they set out a specific, yeah, exactly. So they set out a specific approach to say, let's come up with a fake. So you get people like, you get Descartes. I mean, Descartes' one of the leading figures who's deployed into this. And it's like, well, you can have the God question because we can't get rid of God yet. And it was kind of like, we can't get rid of him yet. I mean, Voltaire is ready to. But the leading thinkers realize they can't get rid of God, but they say, well, God's over here, but God doesn't really interact with the material world. The material world is different. And so all of this prosperity coming from these remarkable breakthroughs by these leading individuals and the socialization of that is creating this abundant prosperity and optimism and joy. And what that brings is more work and more effort and more ingenuity. They've got to say, let's just get this creator side of it out. Let's get this creative relationship of the individual out. And let's make it more about a system of thinking. And that system of thinking ultimately becomes mathematical and descriptive, whether it's economics, supply-demand charts. You've got so much supply, so much demand, you get prices, you get stuff, you get an economy. But it's all basically a description of what we perceive with our senses. It's not about a discovery of principle. It's not about a socialization of those discoveries. It's not about inspiring people to fight and to create and to grow and to prosper. It is to get them to succumb to, not now a feudal aristocracy, but to succumb to a artificial ideology that we're going to call science, that we're going to call economics, or sociology, and so on, rather than recognizing that these questions are ultimately a question all subsumed by are we advancing and fostering development of our species, of our nations, of our cultures? They're not categories that can be defined by some formula set. And that ultimately was the liberal program. And they've attempting to replace that with an American culture from the very beginning, and ultimately were successful at least getting a large portion of our country subjected to this kind of brainwashing by the late 1960s, early 70s. And at least a leading layer of it, which is turned into now a large portion that call themselves liberals, and today they actually meet the definition pretty effectively, where they've taken God or creator or any of these deeper civilizational questions entirely out of the discussion of economics, which has become entirely about money, and science and physics have just become entirely about mathematics and statistics. And so you can see an art has become merely what's in demand, not what's beautiful, not what's based on principle. And this is what Trump threatens. I mean, Trump actually wants to impose standards architecturally that would build beautiful buildings. I mean, he realized he has at least a smell of what this entire system is based on. So does Tucker Carlson. He says, why don't we build beautiful cities? People can just sense it now. But the point is, and so like I said, every major patriotic figure in our country or in the world has operated from this standpoint. What LaRouche had hoped and it looked to create was a political faction that was self-conscious of this kind of philosophical fight, so that not only could we turn the tide in the United States, but that we could consolidate a new political party, a new political movement, not only of the population, of the masses, like Trump has done with MAGA today, but also of leading intellectuals that can make the distinction and see the difference about what this imperial system has attempted to do over the last 500 years, and that it's time to build a leadership that can actually take us, can consolidate the idea of a system of nation states. So hopefully that helps give some background.
Yeah, I'm going to post this Davos speech that we referenced in the course of the discussion that Trump did in 2020, because you don't think that Trump understood what was at the center of this enemy operation of the globalist liberal world order and liberalism. He really takes this on. I mean, you had Klaus Schwab introducing Trump, and then not only, I just want to read one little section from it. I think I got this right here. I was trying to, from the speech prior to him going into talking about what you said, from the standpoint of his reference to the great cathedral of the Brunelleschi Dome, which we've talked about a lot. But he's really taking on this question of the globalist and pessimism and all of the climate agenda and so forth, and really talking to the American people and saying that we can defeat this agenda, we can defeat this order. So I'm going to post the speech and people should take a look at it. I guess somewhere around 23 minutes in, he says, "This is not a time for pessimism. This is a time for optimism. Fear and doubt is not a good thought process, because this is a time for tremendous hope and joy and optimism and action. To embrace the possibilities of tomorrow, we must reject the paranoid prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse." And he goes on to say, "In America, we understand what the pessimists refuse to see." He says, A growing and vibrant market economy focused on the future lifts the human spirit and uh, uh, and creativity strong enough to overcome any challenge, and develops creativity strong enough to overcome any challenge. So I was writing that down, so I didn't have the actual, but you just think about that. He's really going after, and that's what they're trying to drive in the population today, that you have no power. They're driving pessimism with the everything that people are having to go through, with the breakdown of the economy, with what's happening with the border crisis, the continued ongoing wars, and so much more. And so Trump has been taking this on from the very start, and he wasn't afraid to go into the belly of the beast and give people, you don't have to be pessimistic because we can overcome this. And that's what the agenda of this globalist, oligarchical agenda to destroy the nation state, to kill off anybody who would try to protect and defend the nation state. And they see Trump as a major threat to, and as we were just discussing, the idea that you have people coming out now and saying, like Bolton and Dearlove and others, that if Trump were to get elected again, that's the end of Europe, that's the end of NATO, that's the end of everything that they've been trying to push, because they know that Trump will build up something more powerful than anything that they could have imagined to destroy the nation state.
And I guess the concluding point is that, and the populations have finally become aware that this liberal bag of goodies they've been sold doesn't cut it. Like it, and that's ultimately what's happened. They've pushed this thing on steroids with the green agenda. They've totally distorted scientific thought. They've had to run all these bizarre cults, and the population is now in revolt. In Germany right now, as we speak, there's German tractors all up and down the main boulevard heading into Berlin, at the Brandenburg gates. That there is a revolt all over Europe. In the Netherlands, we saw this, and they brought a new government into power after the farm revolts. There's a very likely chance that will happen in Germany. The French government, Macron, is done. I mean, he's got barely any support to speak of, and he's got no third term. The potential for a revolt within Europe to echo what we accomplish here in the United States is entirely possible. And not like it'll all be perfect, but it will create the opening and opportunity to start to build new relationships with real nation states, instead of continuing to push this liberal new world order. So this is it. This is why, I mean, caucuses start in 5 minutes. So it's about to begin. So maybe we should take some questions and see what people think.
Sounds good.